Hi everyone. Today we are going to be talking about the causes of the First Opium War that occurred between Britain and China roughly around the year 1840. Now, in order to discuss the causes of this war, we need to understand some of the underlying conditions that existed between these two nations. The first big contributor to this conflict is the underlying trade imbalance that existed between Britain and China. British merchants were very much in desire of Chinese goods to resell back in Britain. Those goods included porcelain, silk, but most notably tea. And this is, of course, one of the stereotypes of Britain is their love for tea. Some may even call it an addiction to tea. Now, British companies were importing so many Chinese goods during this period that it caused this huge imbalance of trade because China wasn't really interested in the goods that the British were producing. And what the Chinese were willing to accept in exchange for these goods was simply silver. And this meant that silver was going out of circulation in Britain because it was all flowing into China. Now, the way that China operated was what was called the Canton system. And the Canton system is how the Qing Dynasty of China managed trade between Chinese merchants and all European powers. So first off, all the European countries were restricted to a single port, and that was the city of Canton, today Guangzhou, in southern China. And what would happen is that the European powers had a series of 13 warehouses on this island where they would be allowed to unload and display their goods. So a British company would unload their goods at the British warehouse and would put them on display. Then a group of Chinese merchants, they would be known as the Gohong, they would come in and they would examine the goods that were available, and they would dictate the price that they'd be willing to pay and the quantity that they would be willing to purchase. What this meant is that it was not very profitable for British merchants to sell their goods to China. However, like I said earlier, there was this huge desire for Chinese goods on the part of these companies. So the British were trying to find some good that the Chinese would be interested in purchasing that would help to offset this trade imbalance. That good just happened to be opium. With the British taking control of India from the Mughal dynasty that had existed prior, the British also inherited a very well set up system for the growth of opium poppies. And this was largely centered in Bengal, which is today Bangladesh. And the opium poppies, they were not like a new good or a new resource. Opium usage had existed throughout Asia ever since the 1600s, although it was used on a very, very small scale and was really only used by the upper classes. What the British East India Company did in Bengal is it facilitated and encouraged the growth of opium cultivation because the opium poppies, what they British were going to do is they would take the opium, they would put it on board ships that would basically be docked out in the Sea of China. They wouldn't actually take these ships into Canton. And Chinese merchants would sail out to meet them. And the Chinese merchants had like very well-armed boats as well, because these were essentially smugglers. They would come out, they would purchase the opium with silver from these British merchants, and then they would bring it back into China to sell off, essentially to drug dealers, who would then sell the drugs within China. Now, this led to a huge increase in the importation of opium to China. I'm going to just move myself out of the way here for a second so you can see. So if we're looking from 1650 until 1839, because that's going to be roughly right before the beginning of the First Opium War, you'll see that we go from about 50 tons of opium in 1650 to 2,553 tons in 1839. And this is the amount that's making it into China. You'll see that throughout the rest of the 1800s, this is going to grow even further up to 6,500 tons in 1880. Because, spoiler alert, the Chinese are going to lose the First Opium War, and they are going to be forced to accept the legality of opium. Now, opium had a pretty devastating effect on Chinese society. With the increase in opium imports by the British and the wow, just forgot my words there. The huge profitability of selling opium by the Chinese smugglers, you saw opium use across China increase severely amongst all social classes as well, from the poor all the way up to the very rich. And what you would find is widespread creation of what were known as opium dens. And these opium dens were where people would go essentially to smoke opium. They were basically drug houses. Now, opium, in case you're unfamiliar with it, which hopefully you are unfamiliar with it, opium is the foundation today for the medical drug morphine and the street drug heroin. And there's a number of effects that opium has. Let's start by talking about the good effects of opium. And the good kind of medical effect here is that it's a painkiller. And it can be used to very effectively treat long-term chronic pain, which is actually the cause of today's opioid epidemic in the United States, is over-reliance on this type of drugs for chronic pain usage. But for negative effects, there's also quite a number as well. So what you have is you have drowsiness, confusion, memory loss, a lack of energy, hallucinations, convulsions, increased blood pressure in the brain, increased challenges with breathing, slurring of your speech, weight loss, vomiting, nausea, constipation, sexual dysfunction. And so as opium use spread in China, you have more and more people who are developing these symptoms. And what you get is almost a breakdown of the Chinese economy. Because if you think about it, right, if you have a huge amount of Chinese workers and Chinese business owners who are suffering from this, it's really impossible for them to continue to do their work. Just if we look at a couple of these symptoms, like drowsiness, confusion, memory loss, fatigue, it's really hard to be productive when you have those. So the Qing emperor appointed this man, Lin Zexu, to basically be the commissioner in charge of getting rid of opium from China. The Qing emperor at the time made opium illegal, and it was Lin Zexu's mission to enforce that. Now, Lin Zexu was chosen because he was seen as completely incorruptible. He wasn't someone who could be bribed or bought off by the British merchants. In fact, he was called Lin of the Clear Skies because of his high moral standing. Now, Lin Zexu took a very no-nonsense approach to the regulation of opium. He stipulated that any foreign merchants who were caught trading in opium would face the death penalty for doing so. And he actually enforced a series of bonds that all British trade ships had to sign, which stated that they were not trading in opium, and that if they were trading in opium, then the entire stockpile of goods upon that ship could be seized by the Chinese government and ultimately destroyed or done with as the Chinese wanted. So the British merchants, you could probably guess, didn't want all of their trade goods confiscated. But they also didn't want to have to sign these bonds which they felt were a restriction on free trade. And the superintendent of trade, Charles Elliot for Britain, he actually demanded that none of the ships sign this bond at all. Now, where the tensions escalate is with an incident that happens in Kowloon. You have two British sailors who go ashore in Kowloon, and they wind up getting drunk on rice wine. During a brawl that happens afterwards, these two British sailors wind up beating a Chinese man to death. Now, Lin Zexu demanded that the British hand over the sailors responsible so that they could face punishment for their crimes. And this is fairly standard, right? If you commit a crime in a foreign country, you are subject to that country's laws and you'll be put on trial in that country. Now, in this case, Lin Zexu was seeking the death penalty for these two individuals. Charles Elliot refused to turn over these sailors, and he wound up putting these two sailors along with three others on trial. The end result of the trial is that two of the sailors were found guilty of rioting. They were fined 15 pounds and were sentenced to 3 months of hard labor. An additional three sailors were found guilty of rioting and assault. They were fined 25 pounds and were sentenced to 6 months in prison. When those 5 sailors returned to Britain, their sentences were nullified. They were vacated because they found that Charles Elliot's court had no jurisdiction whatsoever. So the murderers got away scot-free, as did the British sailors responsible for helping to start this riot. Lin Zexu becomes incredibly frustrated. At this point, he writes a letter to Queen Victoria of Britain, pointing out the fact that opium usage is illegal in Britain, so why would she be in favor of supporting her country's importing of opium to China? Lin Zexu does not get a response from Queen Victoria. Lin Zexu also sets a new rule that Chinese merchants and Chinese peasants were now prohibited from trading food to British sailors. This meant that there were 60 British ships off the coast of China who now had no ability to get either food or water onto their boats. Charles Elliot took his ship along with 2 others and sailed to the city of Kowloon, where he demanded that the Chinese peasants supply him with food and water. 3 Chinese vessels sailed out to meet Charles Elliot's ship and essentially told him that he could just go away, that they're not going to be giving food or water to them. At that point, Charles Elliot's ships opened fire on the Chinese ships. And in the end, the Chinese ships are forced to retreat due to the superior firepower of the British vessels, and Charles Elliot is able to get food and water for his ships. This is a pretty big deal because at this point it showed that the British were willing to use violence and force to effectively nullify Chinese law. Now, the next big incident takes place at Shanhui in China. And what happens here is you have a ship. And this ship, the Thomas Coates, was crewed by a bunch of Quakers. The Quakers had no problem signing the Chinese bonds saying that they were not selling opium. The Thomas Coates actually believed that Charles Elliot was acting illegally and that he had no right to prevent British vessels from trading in China. So the Thomas Coates sails through into Canton, signs the bond, and conducts trade as usual. In response to this, Charles Elliot sets up a British naval blockade around Shanhui, which was near the mouth of the Pearl River, which is what connected to Canton. A second British ship, the Royal Saxon, then tried to run the blockade to sign the bond to continue trade with China. Charles Elliot's ships opened fire on the Royal Saxon, and then the Royal Saxon opened fire back which is interesting because here you have British ships opening fire on British ships. What happens after this is Chinese vessels then go out to essentially try to intervene. Like there's a firefight happening right off their coast, and they're going out to try to mitigate this. And they initially go out to try to protect the Royal Saxon. And what happens is these Chinese ships are sunk, allowing the Royal Saxon to kind of go on through. But this is a big deal right here because now the British have pretty much committed 2 acts of war against China. So the year's now 1839, and back in Britain, the British Parliament begins a debate about how they're going to respond to China, believing that the Chinese prohibition on opium sale was the big crime here. Now, China did increase their restrictions at this point. They did make it a death penalty to even bring opium to China, not just the sale or trade of it, but now just even bringing it to China was a death sentence. So what Britain ultimately decides is to declare war on China. And the purpose of this war is essentially to make sure that China legalizes the sale of opium, a drug that was devastating to the nation of China. And why did Britain want this? Simple answer is money. So in the ensuing conflict, the First Opium War, the British, due to the technological advances of the Industrial Revolution, are ultimately victorious, and they defeat the Chinese with relative ease. The result is a peace treaty known as the Treaty of Nanking. It's the first of what will be known as the unequal treaties, and it will usher in what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. I'll talk a little bit more later on about the Treaty of Nanking and what was included in it. But one of the big provisions was that Hong Kong had to be given to Britain for a period of 150 years. Britain didn't give it back until 1997, when I was 15 years old, when I was in high school, your age. So again, we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but I hope this helped you to understand the causes of the Opium War, and hopefully will help you to gain some perspective on which side you agree with, whether you believe China had the moral high ground here or whether you believe that Britain had the moral high ground here. All right, everyone, have a good afternoon, and I will talk to you later.